This is the third episode of the video series about the life of Abraham. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, make sure to watch them first. After these events, Sarai came to the conclusion that she could not bear children for Abram, as she was barren. So she gave her maidservant to her husband, hoping she would bear a child on her behalf. Abram agreed to his wife's suggestion and impregnated the maidservant, whose name was Hagar. However, this was the beginning of troubles, which is not surprising, as Sarai ignored God's promise and tried to solve the problem on her own. As a result, Hagar stopped respecting her mistress, as unlike Sarai, she was able to conceive. Sarai, in her distress, started blaming Abram for the situation. But Abram told her that since Hagar was her maidservant, she could deal with her however she wished. Sarai did not hesitate and began treating Hagar so harshly that she drove her away. Later, the angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring in the wilderness and asked her where she was coming from and where she was going. Hagar poured out her troubles to the angel, who comforted her and sent her back to Sarai to apologize. The angel also told her that her descendants would be too numerous to count, and that the child she would bear would be a son, whom she should name Ishmael, for the Lord had heard of her misery. The angel added that he would be a wild man. His hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. Hagar returned to Abram, gave birth to a son, and named him Ishmael. At that time, Abram was 86 years old. 13 years later, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord renewed his covenant with him. This renewal meant that the Lord gave Abram a new name, Abraham. God gave him this name because he would make him the father of many nations. Nations and kings would descend from him, and God would establish his covenant with Abraham and his descendants. The condition of this covenant was that Abraham had to walk before the Lord blamelessly, acknowledging the Lord as his only God and obeying his commands. The sign of this covenant was circumcision, which every male in Abraham's household had to undergo, whether born into the family or bought as a servant. Newborn boys were to be circumcised on the 8th day, while those already living were to be circumcised immediately. Circumcision involved the removal of a small piece of skin from the end of the male genitalia. God took this requirement seriously, declaring that anyone who was not circumcised had to be cut off from his people, as it signified rejection of his covenant. Afterward, God also gave Sarai a new name, Sarah. He told Abraham that within a year he would bless them with a son. Abraham fell face down but laughed to himself, doubting how this could happen since he would be 100 years old and Sarah would be 90. He hoped God would instead bless Ishmael, but the Lord repeated his promise. Sarah would give birth to a son for Abraham, and they were to name him Isaac. God also promised to establish his covenant with Isaac, just as he had with Abraham. Following this, Abraham obeyed God and circumcised every male in his household as commanded. After this, the Lord appeared to Abraham in the oak grove of Mamre in the form of 3 men. Abraham ran to meet them immediately and went out of his way to serve them, not caring how much effort it required. He washed their feet, seated them under a tree, brought them bread, and even prepared a fine, tender calf which he served to them, waiting as they ate. Even such efforts pale compared to how much God has given us. Therefore, like Abraham, we should not look for excuses when it comes to serving the Lord. However, things became complicated when one of the men revealed to Abraham that in a year when they returned, Sarah would have a son. God had already told this to Abraham, but now Sarah overheard it. She laughed to herself in disbelief, thinking it was impossible since both she and her husband were old. The Lord then confronted Abraham, asking why Sarah had laughed. Sarah denied it out of fear, but of course, she could not deceive the Lord. To be continued.